I watched the wine glass tremble in Julian's hand as he realized the man standing behind him wasn't just a guest. He was a legend, and that legend had just heard Julian call me a desk jockey who didn't know the first thing about real pressure. But it was the name I whispered next that made the general's eyes turn to ice. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. He just looked at Julian and said, "Apologize. Right now. Or leave this house." Before I tell you how a single word changed the entire room that night, take a second to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who believes first impressions are not always the truth. And I would love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. Leave it in the comments below. Now let me take you back to the beginning. 2 hours earlier I was sitting alone in my car, outside one of the most expensive charity galas in downtown Chicago. The building looked like something from a movie. Glass walls, golden lights, valets moving from one luxury car to another, men in tailored suits, women wearing dresses that probably cost more than my first car. I sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel. For a moment I considered turning around and driving home. Not because I was nervous. I had spent years stepping out of aircraft into places most people would never willingly visit. Fear wasn't the problem. The problem was fitting in. War teaches you many things. One of them is that the hardest battlefield isn't always the one with bullets. Sometimes it's a room full of people who think they already know who you are. I checked my reflection in the mirror. Black dress, simple makeup, hair pulled back. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to attract attention. That was how I preferred it. I locked the car and stepped into the cold evening air. The city lights reflected across the pavement as I made my way toward the entrance. Inside the ballroom everything sparkled. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Soft piano music drifted through the room. Servers carried silver trays filled with drinks and expensive appetizers. The entire place smelled like luxury. And ego. Lots of ego. I spotted my friend Lauren almost immediately. She waved me over with a bright smile. "Maya, you made it." I hugged her. Lauren had been trying for months to get me to attend one of these events. She worked with several veteran charities and insisted it would be good networking. I wasn't convinced. Still, she was one of the few people who had stayed in touch after my transition back into civilian life. That meant something. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "You still have time to run," I joked. She laughed. "Too late. I've already told people about you." I groaned. "Lauren." "What?" "Relax. I didn't tell them everything." That answer worried me more than it reassured me. She linked her arm through mine and guided me through the crowd. As we walked, I noticed the familiar looks. Curiosity, assessment, judgment. People always try to place you into a category. They want a label. Something easy. Something comfortable. Veteran. Consultant. Woman in a black dress. Quiet. Reserved. The labels never tell the whole story. Lauren stopped near a small group gathered around a tall man holding a wine glass. The moment I saw him, I knew exactly who he was. Not because I had met him before. Because I had met dozens just like him. Confident. Successful. Charming. And completely aware of it. "Julian," Lauren said. "There's someone I want you to meet." He turned. His smile appeared instantly. Perfect. Practiced. The kind of smile people learn after years of boardrooms and negotiations. "Julian Carter," he said. "Maya." We shook hands. His grip lingered just long enough to establish dominance. At least that was what he probably thought. I simply released my hand and smiled politely. "So you're Maya," he said. "I've heard interesting things." That sentence carried an edge. The kind hidden beneath friendliness. Lauren excused herself a moment later to greet another guest, leaving Julian and me standing together. His eyes scanned me briefly, evaluating, calculating. The same way people inspect merchandise before deciding whether it's valuable. "So," he said, "I hear you were in the Air Force." I nodded. "For a while." "For a while," he laughed. "Most people usually mention ranks and medals by this point. I don't." That seemed to surprise him. For a second. Then the smirk returned. "Let me guess." He took a sip of wine. "Logistics." I said nothing. "Administrative work?" Still nothing. His smile widened. "Maybe you made sure the coffee stayed hot during meetings." Several people nearby chuckled. Not because it was funny, because they didn't know any better. I could feel eyes turning toward us, watching, waiting, seeing how I would respond. Years ago I might have answered differently. Years ago I might have felt the need to prove something. But experience changes you. The people who constantly talk about strength are usually the ones trying hardest to convince themselves they have it. So I simply looked at him. Calmly. Silently. That made him more uncomfortable than any insult ever could. People like Julian expect reactions. They feed on them. When they don't get one, they become restless. And restless people make mistakes. "Wow," he said with a laugh. "Tough crowd." A few more guests gathered around. The conversation had become entertainment. I could see it happening. Everyone loves a spectacle when they think there are no consequences. Julian leaned slightly closer. "You know, I always find military stories interesting." There it was. The setup. The performance. The assumption that real experiences exist for public consumption. "Do you?" I asked. "Absolutely." His eyes brightened, like he had finally gotten me to engage. Every hero has a story. I hated that word. Hero. It makes everything sound cleaner than it was. Cleaner than fear. Cleaner than loss. Cleaner than guilt. Julian continued. "Come on." He grinned. "There has to be a nickname." The group laughed. Everybody in the military has a nickname. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger. Memory. Those names rarely come from glory. Most are born from pain. Or mistakes. Or things people survived. Things they never completely leave behind. Julian didn't know that. He thought he was asking for a funny story. A harmless anecdote. A piece of entertainment. He raised his glass. "What was yours?" The room seemed quieter now. Not silent. Just focused. Waiting. Watching. Expecting. I looked around the table. Then back at Julian. For a moment I considered refusing to answer. But something told me this night wasn't going to end quietly. Not anymore. So I set down my drink, folded my hands together, and spoke two simple words. "The shepherd." The smile on Julian's face immediately widened. Several people exchanged confused looks. Someone chuckled. Another person laughed. Julian laughed loudest of all. "The shepherd." He nearly spilled his wine. "Seriously." His laughter echoed through the room. And then he said the sentence that changed everything. "The shepherd? What did you do? Lose a few sheep in the desert?" The laughter spread. A few guests joined in, not knowing what that name actually meant, not understanding why every muscle in my body had suddenly gone still. Then a chair scraped against the floor behind him. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a knife, and every conversation stopped, because everyone recognized the man who had just stood up. And the look on his face told us all the evening was about to become something very different. The laughter died so quickly it almost felt unnatural. 1 second people were smiling. The next they were staring. General Vance stood motionless behind Julian. His expression wasn't angry. That would have been easier. It was something colder. Something heavier. The kind of look that comes from memories nobody wants to revisit. Julian noticed the silence and slowly turned around. His confident smile began to fade. "General," he said with an awkward laugh, It's just a joke. The general didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on me. For a moment, neither of us were standing inside a ballroom. We were somewhere else entirely. Somewhere far away. A place built from dust and darkness and decisions that never stop following you. Then the general finally spoke. You don't know that name, do you, son? Julian shifted uneasily. No, sir. I didn't think so. The room remained silent. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Because everyone sensed they had accidentally stepped into a story far larger than themselves. The general slowly walked forward. His voice was calm, but every word carried weight. It wasn't a joke to the men who survived because of that name. Julian swallowed. The confidence he'd worn all evening was beginning to crack. I didn't mean any disrespect. The general looked at him. Intent doesn't erase ignorance. Nobody said a word. The piano music continued somewhere in the background, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to another room, another world. The general turned toward me. For a brief moment I saw something in his eyes I recognized immediately. Respect. Not because of rank, not because of achievements, but because he knew the cost. Very few people ever understand the cost. Most only see the result. They see the medals, the stories, the headlines. They never see the nights afterward, the memories, the faces, the weight. General Vance understood all of it, because he carried his own. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. Then he returned his attention to Julian. You asked about her nickname. Julian didn't answer. You wanted a story. The room seemed to lean closer. People who had spent the evening discussing investments and business mergers now stood frozen around white tablecloths and crystal glasses. Waiting. Listening. The general looked back at me. His voice softened. You don't have to tell it. I appreciated that. More than he probably realized. Because most people ask questions without considering what answers cost. I looked down at the table. My reflection stared back from the polished surface of my water glass. For a second I considered ending the conversation right there. Smiling politely. Changing the subject. Walking away. That would have been easier. But then I noticed Julian. Not his expensive suit. Not the watch on his wrist. Not the confidence. The curiosity. The entitlement. The belief that every story existed for his entertainment. And suddenly I remembered another face. A young man sitting in the back of a transport aircraft years earlier. 24 years old. Terrified. Trying desperately not to show it. He never made it home. Most people in this room would never know his name. That thought settled something inside me. I slowly took a breath. Then I looked at Julian. You want to know where the nickname came from? His face tightened. Only if you're comfortable sharing. Interesting. 5 minutes earlier he hadn't cared about comfort. Now he did. Funny how quickly perspective changes. I nodded. The mission wasn't supposed to be complicated. Nobody moved. The entire table was listening now. Most disasters start that way. A few nervous smiles appeared, then vanished, because they could hear something in my voice. Something serious. Something real. It was a routine operation. I stared past the ballroom, past the chandeliers, past Chicago, back toward a different place, a different time. The intelligence report looked solid. I laughed quietly, a humorless laugh. It always looks solid until reality arrives. The general lowered his eyes. He already knew where this was going. I continued. We were supporting a joint operation in a mountain region. The ballroom disappeared from my mind. The memory returned with perfect clarity. Cold air. Then oxygen. Sharp rock formations stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The weather forecast showed a safe extraction window. I paused. At least that's what the report said. Several people shifted in their seats. The atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody was thinking about cocktails anymore. Nobody cared about networking. They were inside the story now. And once people enter a real story, it's difficult to leave. We landed before sunrise. The memory sharpened. Every detail returned. The smell of fuel. The sound of equipment. The tension hidden behind professional expressions. The first few hours went exactly as planned. I looked down. My fingers tightened slightly around the glass. Then everything started falling apart. The room remained silent. A server approached our table, saw the expressions, and quietly walked away. Nobody even noticed. Communication became unstable. I continued. The weather shifted faster than expected. The terrain worked against us. I could see it again. The mountains. The clouds rolling across the sky. The feeling in my stomach that something wasn't right. Experienced people learn to trust those feelings. Sometimes they're the only warning you get. Then we received new information. I stopped, because even after all these years I still hated that moment. The moment everything changed. The moment plans became survival. The enemy presence wasn't what we were told. Several guests exchanged glances. I could see the realization spreading through them. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't a heroic speech. This was a memory. And memories don't follow scripts. We weren't prepared for what was waiting. My voice remained calm. But inside I could feel the old tension returning. The old pressure. The old fear. Fear people pretend doesn't exist. Every soldier feels fear. The brave ones simply keep moving anyway. We were outnumbered. Julian's eyes widened slightly. The general remained silent. Listening. Remembering. We adapted. I shrugged. That's what you do. But the situation kept getting worse. Outside the ballroom windows, the city lights glowed against the darkness. Inside the room, nobody dared interrupt. The extraction timeline collapsed. I could hear the helicopters in my memory, the radio traffic, the urgency, the confusion. The weather became dangerous. The mountains vanished beneath storms. Visibility disappeared. Every decision became harder. Every minute became more expensive. We received updated orders. My throat tightened slightly. Even now, even after all this time, some memories never lose their edges. The room felt smaller, closer, waiting, listening. The contractors had to be left behind. The words landed heavily. A woman near the end of the table covered her mouth. Someone whispered softly, "What?" I nodded. That was the order. The silence deepened. Nobody judged. Nobody questioned. They simply listened. Because for the first time all evening they understood they were hearing something that mattered. I stared into my glass, seeing another place, another life. We were told extraction was the priority. The general closed his eyes briefly. He remembered. Of course he remembered. People who serve never forget certain days. No matter how much time passes, no matter how many years go by. The aircraft were preparing to leave. My voice dropped lower. The storm was getting worse. I could hear it again. The rotors, the wind, the radio messages, the urgency, and then the faces. Those faces. The men standing below, watching, waiting, realizing what was happening, realizing they weren't coming with us. The ballroom vanished completely. I was back there now, standing inside the noise, inside the chaos, inside the impossible choice. And the next thing I was about to tell them would explain exactly why people started calling me the shepherd, and why I wished they never had. I can still see their faces. That is the part nobody tells you about memory. People think memories fade. Some do. The important ones don't. The important ones stay sharp. Sharper than photographs. Sharper than scars. Years can pass. Entire lives can change. And yet a single moment can return as if it happened 5 minutes ago. That moment never left me. The storm was building around us. The mountains were disappearing beneath thick clouds. The wind screamed through the valley. Every radio transmission sounded worse than the one before it. The extraction team was running out of options. So were we. I remember standing near the aircraft. Equipment rattling. Rotors spinning. Everyone moving fast. Everyone focused on survival. And then I looked across the valley. 12 men. 12 exhausted men. Some injured. Some barely able to stand. All of them staring toward us. Waiting. Hoping. Trusting. That trust was the hardest part. Because they believed we would get them home. And at that moment I wasn't sure we could. A voice crackled through my headset. The order came again. Leave now. Immediately. No debate. No discussion. No delay. I closed my eyes. For just a second. Sometimes a single second feels like an hour. I thought about the weather. I thought about the risk. I thought about my team. Then I looked back toward those men. One of them was helping another stay upright. Another was trying to stop bleeding through a bandage already soaked red. One man couldn't even stand anymore. He was sitting against a rock. Waiting. Watching. Trusting. That trust felt heavier than any order. The aircraft crew was shouting. The storm was almost on top of us. We had seconds. Not minutes. Seconds. I climbed aboard. The ramp began closing. And for one terrible moment I thought that was it. I thought I was leaving. I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life remembering those faces. The aircraft started lifting. The valley slowly dropped beneath us. I looked through the opening. The men were getting smaller. 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 Until something inside me snapped. Not anger. Not courage. Something else. Something simpler. I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave. I grabbed my gear. The crew thought I was crazy. Maybe I was. One of them tried stopping me. Another shouted over the noise. But the decision had already been made. Some choices happen before your brain catches up. I jumped. Back into the valley. Back into the storm. Back into a situation every reasonable person was trying to escape. The ballroom remained completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I could see it in their eyes. They weren't imagining a movie anymore. They were imagining themselves. And wondering what they would have done. Most people never face moments like that. Moments where every option hurts. Moments where there is no perfect answer. Only consequences. I looked at Julian. The color had drained from his face. The man who had joked about sheep no longer looked amused. Not even close. I continued. When the aircraft disappeared, I was alone. Those words still sounded strange. Even after all these years. Alone. No backup. No rescue. No guarantees. Just me. A storm. And 12 men who needed help. The general lowered his head. He already knew the rest. But he listened anyway. Because some stories deserve to be heard. No matter how painful they are. I found them before nightfall. The memory returned again. Cold rain. Dark clouds. Exhaustion. Fear. The men looked stunned when they saw me. One of them actually laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because he couldn't believe I had come back. None of them could. I remember one of them staring at me. Then shaking his head. What are you doing here? I smiled. Getting you out. Simple words. At the time I wasn't even sure they were true. But people need hope. Especially when hope is all they have left. The first night was brutal. The storm intensified. Temperatures dropped. Visibility vanished. We couldn't risk movement. Not yet. So we sheltered among rocks and broken terrain. Listening. Waiting. Praying. Every sound felt dangerous. Every shadow felt alive. Sleep came in fragments, minutes at a time. Nobody truly rested. The second day was worse. Food was limited. Water became a concern. Injuries slowed us down. One man had a damaged leg. Another could barely breathe without pain. Several were suffering from exposure. Moving them through mountain terrain felt impossible. But impossible wasn't an option. So we moved. One step, then another, then another. Hour after hour. The mountains seemed endless. Every ridge revealed another ridge. Every climb revealed another climb. I carried equipment. I carried supplies. Sometimes I carried people. When someone fell behind, we stopped. When someone couldn't walk, we helped. When someone wanted to quit, we refused. Because survival isn't usually one grand heroic moment. It's thousands of tiny decisions. Keep moving. Keep breathing. Keep going. Again. And again. And again. By the third day, everyone was exhausted. Including me. Especially me. I hadn't slept properly. I hadn't eaten enough. My body hurt everywhere. My mind felt foggy. But I couldn't stop. Leaders don't get that luxury. Not when others depend on them. That realization is terrifying. Because people think leadership is power. It isn't. Leadership is responsibility. Sometimes unbearable responsibility. I remember crossing a narrow section of terrain late that afternoon. One of the men stumbled. His legs simply gave out. He collapsed. Hard. For several seconds he didn't move. Nobody spoke. The silence terrified me. I rushed toward him. Knelt beside him. Checked his breathing. He was conscious. Barely. His eyes opened. And he whispered something I'll never forget. Leave me. The ballroom remained frozen. I swallowed. Even now those words hurt. Leave me. He said it again. Weakly. Slowly. Like he'd already accepted his fate. I looked at him. Really looked at him. A husband. A father. A son. A human being. Not a mission objective. Not a statistic. Person. And I knew immediately what my answer would be. No. He tried arguing. I wouldn't listen. None of us would. So we lifted him. And we kept moving. Because sometimes survival means carrying each other. Literally. The general's eyes glistened slightly. Just for a moment. I noticed. Veterans recognized certain memories in each other. The room was completely different now. The arrogance. The laughter. The superiority. Gone. Replaced by something else. Respect. Real respect. Not the kind people perform. The kind they feel. I looked at Julian again. His eyes were fixed on me. No smirk. No jokes. No interruptions. Just understanding. Or at least the beginning of understanding. Then I took a slow breath. Because the hardest part of the story was still ahead. The part that explained why the nickname spread through units I had never even met. The part that followed us after those 3 days ended. The part that changed my life forever. And the part that came with a cost nobody in that ballroom could possibly imagine. By the end of the third day, none of us looked human anymore. At least that is how it felt. We were covered in mud, dust, sweat, and exhaustion. Every movement hurt. Every breath felt earned. The storm had finally weakened, but it left behind a different problem. The mountains were soaked. The ground was unstable. And every step carried risk. Still we kept moving. Because stopping wasn't an option. I remember checking the horizon constantly. Looking for any sign. Any signal. Any indication that someone was searching for us. Hours passed. Nothing. More hours. Still nothing. The men were reaching their limits. Honestly, so was I. People often ask where determination comes from. I wish I had. A beautiful answer. I don't. Sometimes determination comes from having no alternative. Sometimes the only reason you keep going is because the consequences of stopping are worse. That was where we were. A group of exhausted people refusing to quit because quitting wasn't survivable. Late that afternoon, we reached a ridgeline. I climbed ahead to scout the terrain. The wind hit my face, cold and sharp. I remember looking down into the distance. At first I thought I was imagining it. A tiny movement, a shape, then another. My heart nearly stopped. I grabbed my binoculars, focused, and saw them. A search team, miles away, but real. For several seconds I just stood there staring, not moving, not speaking. After 3 days of uncertainty, hope felt almost unbelievable. One of the contractors called out behind me, "What is it?" I lowered the binoculars. For the first time in days I smiled. A real smile. "We're going home." The reaction was immediate. Some laughed. Some cried. One man dropped to his knees. Another simply covered his face with both hands. Relief is a strange emotion. People think it arrives like a celebration. Sometimes it arrives like collapse. Your body finally realizes it survived. And all the tension you've been carrying suddenly crashes down at once. The rescue wasn't immediate. Still took hours. But eventually communication was established. Coordinates were confirmed. Plans were made. The impossible was finally becoming possible. As I spoke, I noticed several people around the table quietly wiping their eyes. The story had pulled them somewhere they didn't expect to go tonight. Maybe that was good. Maybe people need reminders that the world is bigger than boardrooms and bank accounts. The rescue team reached us shortly before sunset. I'll never forget that moment. The sound of voices, the sight of familiar uniforms, the realization that we had actually made it. One of the rescuers looked at the group, then looked at me. His expression was confused. "How many are here?" I told him. He counted again, then again, making sure. Because according to the reports, some of those men should not have been standing there. Some should not have survived. Yet there they were. All 12. Every single one. Alive. I paused. The ballroom remained silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Nobody wanted the moment broken. "The nickname started afterward," I said quietly. "I never asked for it. In fact, I hated it." The general nodded immediately. He understood. People always assume nicknames are rewards. Sometimes they're reminders. Sometimes they're burdens. One of the contractors had told the story after we returned. Then another. Then another. Soon it spread further than I ever expected. Different units. Different commands. Different bases. People I'd never met somehow knew the story. And somewhere along the way they started calling me the shepherd. Because I refused to leave anyone behind. Because I kept bringing people home. At least that was the version they told. The cleaner version. The easier version. The version that fits into speeches and ceremonies. But real life isn't that simple. I looked down at my hands. For a moment I didn't speak. The silence in the room grew heavier. Because there was something else. Something important. Something people rarely consider when they hear stories like this. The nickname left out part of the truth. Julian frowned slightly. What truth? I looked at him. The confidence was completely gone now. Only curiosity remained. The honest kind. The respectful kind. I took a slow breath. The truth is that not everyone came home. The room froze. A woman near the table lowered her eyes. The general's expression softened. He already knew. Of course he knew. Not that mission, I continued. That mission ended differently. But there were others. The memories surfaced immediately. Faces. Names. Voices. Friends. Good people. People who should have had decades ahead of them. People whose families expected them to walk through the front door again. People who never got that chance. I swallowed hard. The ballroom felt very far away now. There are names I still remember every day. Nobody spoke. There are birthdays I still remember. Still silence. There are families I still think about. A knot formed in my throat. Even after all these years. Some losses never become easier. You simply learn how to carry them. The nickname made me sound stronger than I was. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of strangers who suddenly didn't feel like strangers anymore. There were days I was terrified. There were days I doubted myself. There were days I made mistakes. I smiled sadly. And there were days I cried where nobody could see. Several people lowered their heads. Because honesty does something perfection never can. It connects people. The general finally spoke. His voice was calm, quiet, powerful. That's exactly why the name mattered. I looked at him. He continued. People think courage means not feeling fear. He shook his head. It doesn't. The room listened carefully. Courage is feeling fear and moving anyway. His words settled over the table. Simple. True. Unforgettable. I could see Julian processing everything. Replaying every joke he'd made. Every assumption. Every careless word. The realization was written across his face. For the first time all evening, he truly understood how little he knew. Not just about me. About people in general. About the stories hidden behind ordinary faces. He slowly set down his wine glass, then looked directly at me. And what happened next surprised everyone in the room, including me, because the man who had spent the evening trying to impress everyone was finally about to reveal who he really was. And sometimes that moment is harder than facing any audience. Sometimes admitting you're wrong requires more courage than pretending you're right. The room waited, watching, listening. As Julian prepared to say something that would change the rest of the night, Julian stood there for several seconds without speaking. Nobody rushed him. Nobody tried to rescue him from the silence. Because some moments deserve space. And this was one of them. The confident businessman who had controlled every conversation all evening suddenly looked like a completely different person. Not weak, just honest. Maybe for the first time that night. He looked at me, then lowered his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I expected. I owe you an apology. The room remained silent. Julian took a slow breath. No. He shook his head. Actually, I owe you more than that. For a moment he seemed to struggle with the words. Not because they were difficult to say, because they were real. And real things are often harder than polished speeches. I judged you the second I met you. He looked directly at me. I saw a quiet woman in a black dress and assumed I knew your entire story. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. I thought being successful meant understanding people. A sad smile crossed his face. Tonight proved I don't understand nearly as much as I thought. The honesty surprised everyone, including me, especially me, because genuine humility is rare, very rare. In boardrooms, in politics, in life. Julian slowly stepped forward. I'm sorry. There was no performance in it. No audience. No attempt to save face. Just a man acknowledging he was wrong. I studied him for a moment. Then I nodded. Thank you. The tension that had gripped the room finally began to ease. People exhaled. Shoulders relaxed. Conversation slowly returned. But something had changed. The atmosphere felt different now. More human. Less artificial. The general placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. Remember this feeling. Julian looked up. The general's expression was calm. Titles impress people. He glanced around the ballroom. Money impresses people. Then he pointed gently toward me. But character earns respect. Nobody argued. Nobody could. As everyone knew he was right. The general turned toward me. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. A small smile. The kind shared between people who understand things that don't need explaining. You never liked that nickname, did you? I laughed softly. The first genuine laugh I'd had all evening. No. The general chuckled. I figured. Several people looked confused. One woman finally asked the question, "Why didn't you like it?" I thought about that for a moment, then answered honestly, "Because every time someone says it, I remember the people who aren't here to tell their own stories." The room became quiet again. Not uncomfortable. Respectful. I continued. People remember the person who came back. I looked down briefly. They don't always remember the ones who didn't. The general nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting memories of his own. The kind veterans carry forever, visible only to each other. The rest of the evening passed differently than anyone expected. The conversations changed. People stopped talking about investments and promotions. Instead, they talked about family, about sacrifice, about gratitude, about the moments that actually matter. Several guests approached me throughout the night, not to ask about military operations, not to ask about combat, not to ask for exciting stories. Instead, they shared their own. A woman told me about losing her father. A man spoke about caring for his disabled brother. Another guest described rebuilding his life after a devastating accident. I realized something important. Everyone carries something. Some burdens are visible. Most aren't. The quietest person in the room might be fighting the hardest battle. The strongest looking person might be hanging on by a thread. The happiest smile might be hiding years of pain. You simply never know. And that's exactly why respect should come before judgment. Hours later, the gala finally began winding down. Guests started leaving. The music softened. The crowd grew smaller. I found myself standing near the entrance with General Vance. Together we watched people collect their coats and head into the night. For a while neither of us spoke. Then the general broke the silence. "You know something?" "What?" He smiled. "That story still gets told." I laughed. "Unfortunately." "No." He shook his head. "Fortunately." I looked at him. The general's expression became serious. "People need reminders." "Reminders of what?" He stared out through the glass doors toward the city lights. "That courage still exists." For a moment I didn't know what to say. Then I quietly answered, "So does kindness." The general smiled. "Exactly." A few minutes later we said our goodbyes. I stepped outside into the cool Chicago night. The air felt crisp, clean, peaceful. The city stretched around me in every direction. Lights glowing against the darkness. Traffic moving in the distance. Life continuing as it always does. I walked slowly toward my car. The same car where I'd sat earlier wondering whether I should even attend the gala. Funny how life works. The moments we almost avoid are sometimes the ones we need most. I unlocked the door and paused before getting inside. The night was quiet, and for the first time all evening I allowed myself to think about the past. About the valley. About the storm. About the men who made it home. And the ones who didn't. The memories still hurt. Maybe they always would. But I had learned something over the years. Pain doesn't disappear. Changes shape. It becomes part of you. Not something you carry alone. Something that helps you understand other people. Something that teaches compassion. Something that reminds you what truly matters. I looked up at the stars barely visible above the city skyline. Then I thought about Julian. Earlier that evening he had seen me as a stereotype. A quiet woman. An easy target. A simple story. By the end of the night he saw something else. A human being. And honestly, that mattered more than any apology. Because understanding changes people. Sometimes permanently. I got into the car and started the engine. As I pulled away from the curb, the ballroom disappeared behind me. The lights grew smaller, then vanished completely. But one thought stayed with me the entire drive home. People think nicknames are trophies, stories, conversation pieces. They're not. Sometimes they're reminders of impossible choices. Sometimes they're memories wrapped inside a single word. Sometimes they're scars nobody can see. And sometimes they're warnings. Warnings not to assume you know someone's story simply because you've heard their name. Because the truth is this: the quietest person at the table may have survived things you cannot imagine. The gentlest person in the room may have carried weights that would break others. And the most ordinary face you pass tomorrow may be hiding an extraordinary history. So be careful how you judge people. Be careful what assumptions you make. And above all, be careful what you laugh at. Because behind every person is a story. And behind some stories is a price that can never truly be measured. If you've ever been underestimated, judged unfairly, or carried a story that few people understand, let me know in the comments below. And wherever you are in the world tonight, remember this: respect costs nothing, but it can mean everything. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.